Welcome to Living Yoga. My name is Darren Main, and I do this podcast, this video podcast, audio podcast on a regular basis because it gives me a great opportunity to talk to some of those amazing people in the world. Some are yoga teachers, others authors, musicians, activists, you name it. Whoever I want to talk to, I invite on to inspire me and hopefully you. And today I have Sadhvi Bhagawati Saraswati. That is such a mouthful, but I love it. And we will get to how she got that beautiful name in just a moment. She's also the author of a brand new book called Hollywood to the Himalayas, which just came out recently, and I got an advance copy, which was really nice. And she is going to be joining me at Grace Cathedral in September. We'll get to that. September 21st, 2021, depending on when you're watching this, at Grace Cathedral. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Sadhvi, it is so good to see you. I miss seeing you in person.
Darren, it's so wonderful to see you as well. And yeah, it's been much too long since we've been together, either in India or in San Francisco, but especially
I know, you're like my one friend that's like India and San Francisco. It's I have groups of friends in both places, but you're like the one that we share multiple parts of the world together. So I have interviewed you in the past, and we've done events at the cathedral and so on. So some viewers and listeners may be familiar with your story, but I think it would be nice to just get people caught up for those who don't know you. You're a Swami, and so thus the orange robes, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what exactly is a Swami.
Sure.
But you're also from the United States. So how did this young woman from Los Angeles find her way to India and wearing orange robes? That's a short story, I know. But
Yes. So that's the story that it's taken me 50 years to live. I just turned 50 a few months ago. And it's an extraordinary story. It's the story that I've been so excited and blessed to share in my new memoir, Hollywood to the Himalayas, or Himalayas, as we say in India. And in short, though, it's really extraordinary. It's been such a blessing, such grace, such a spiritual adventure. I grew up quite literally in Hollywood amongst actors and actresses and the children of actors and actresses, and had really everything that in the West we are told one needs to be happy. A world of opportunity. I grew up in great privilege in a very well-to-do family. I had the best education that one can get. I graduated from Stanford University. I was in the midst of doing my PhD in psychology. And so from the outside looking in, you would have said, this woman has it all. I mean, she's got all the opportunity, she's got all the privilege, she's got the experience, summer camp in Switzerland and traveling all over the world, and all of that which you would expect from a very privileged, a very blessed, a very affluent on every level upbringing. And yet, I really suffered. I suffered deeply inside. I had been through actually great trauma in early childhood. I had been abused in my very early childhood, sexually abused. And then I had been abandoned by my biological father. And the impact of that, while everything else outside was perfect and my mom married the most wonderful, wonderful man who became just the most wonderful everything you could imagine dad in the world. Nonetheless, that early childhood trauma really impacted me. And as I moved into adolescence and into my early 20s, that pain really churned within me. And I did what so many of us do, which is look to things to alleviate the pain. And whether it's alcohol or drugs or food or sex or shopping, we turn to these things to, we think, actually alleviate it. All it does is very temporarily numb us chemically, whether the chemical is alcohol, drugs, carbohydrates, endorphins, whatever it may be, or some neurochemical combination. We do that because we don't know what else to do. And by the time I was 25, I had gotten to a place where I was really managing my life. I felt like I had everything under control. I was in the middle of this PhD program, taking 21 units a quarter and getting straight A's. I had gotten married right out of college. One of the repercussions or defense mechanisms, or however you think about it, of the abandonment had been that throughout my life, I had gone kind of from boyfriend to boyfriend to boyfriend, ensuring that I was never alone, and had then gotten married literally 2 months after I graduated from undergraduate. And things were being managed. My relationships were being managed. My school was being managed. I was learning to manage my addiction. I was managing my pain. And I thought things were going great because that was the framework I was given. No one ever says, or no one ever said to me, hey, by the way, managing your life isn't the best it can be. Managing your life is not the highest goal. Actually, beyond management is freedom. And sure, management is better than not managing it. I mean, if you have a choice between managing your life and not managing it, managing is obviously better. But that's the beginning. That's the first step. That's not the last step. But I never knew that there was anything else to reach for, to strive for. It seemed like with my history and my issues, managing my life was kind of as good as it was going to get and a great success. So when I ended up in India on a adventure trip with a backpack because my husband had wanted to go, I knew nothing about India. I was not religious. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish community in Los Angeles, but was never religious. But I also was never one of those people who say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I was an academic. I was a scientist and hadn't learned anything about India, didn't know anything about the religious tradition or the culture or the spirituality. But I loved Indian food, and I was a strict vegetarian. And having traveled a lot in Europe and South America and around the US I was actually a vegan. I was a very, very strict vegan. Having to have conversations with waiters in languages that I didn't speak about what the broth of their vegetable soup was made with, or whether the salad dressing had eggs in it, was always a great challenge. And so I agreed to go to India because I loved the food. And got to Rishikesh. I mean, obviously I'm fast forwarding through a bunch, but in this great spiritual adventure, get to Rishikesh. It was the first place we went. And one of the beautiful rivers or the streams that run through Hollywood to the Himalayas, is that stream of learning to trust yourself, that river of faith in oneself. And for me, all of the choices of where to go, which hotel to stay in when we get there, all of these little, seemingly kind of inconsequential decisions were part of this river of learning to trust myself and knowing that I was being guided. And in retrospect, I look back and realize, of course, this was grace. This was divine guidance. This was intuition. This was higher self, whatever term we use for it. So we get to Rishikesh and we get to the hotel I had determined we were going to stay at, which was the only hotel near where the ashram I now live in was. Now there's a bunch of hotels there, but 25 years ago, there was only one. And that was the one I had decided we were going to stay at. And after putting down our bags at the hotel, I say, I'm going to go put my feet in the river. I was always a nature person. Rivers, mountains, trees, anything natural called me. I was hot. I was tired. We'd been traveling. And so I walked down to the river. And I stood on the banks of this river I didn't even know was sacred. And I had this extraordinary experience of being touched by the divine, of experiencing the presence of God outside of me, inside of me, with no border or boundary between the outside and the inside. And this experience of divine perfection from which I wasn't separate. And it made me know this is where I am meant to be. This is where I'm meant to stay. But I didn't know where. I mean, I was just on the steps of the sacred river. And over the next 7 to 10 days, there's this really amazing and fun and kind of incredible series of experiences that happened that brought me to the ashram I now live in, Parmarth Niketan. Things quite literally like hearing a voice. As a scientist, not a mystic, hearing a voice say that's where I was supposed to stay. Literally getting my feet glued and stuck to the pavement in the ashram, not being able to walk out. All sorts of these things that I do talk about in the book. We don't have time today for it, but made me know this is where I'm meant to be. And I've been there, Darren, as you know, 25 years, and it's been extraordinary. And of course, yes, taking the vows of renunciation, being initiated into the sacred order that we call sannyas, that order where when you're a male, they say Swami. When you're a female, they say either Sadhvi or Swamini. Either way, that order of monastic renunciation. And it's been such an amazing blessing to be able to serve as this vehicle, as a vessel of the divine.
I have a follow-up question, because I've obviously talked to you many times, and I know I learned a lot about you in that. Like every time I talk to you, I'm like, wow, you are so interesting. And I have a few follow-ups that I think are really important. One is, this is the first time I've heard you at least publicly share about past trauma and challenges, painful experiences. And I think that that's a really powerful, I think so often we see spiritual leaders and they talk only about the light and not the darkness that preceded it. And I think that can make some people feel like, well, my life's a mess. There's no hope for me. I mean, sure, for that Sadhvi woman over there with the orange robes, but yes. Me now. And I'd love to hear how that influenced your journey, but also is that saying when you talk to God, they call it prayer. When God answers, they call it schizophrenia. And I would think too.
We say when God answers, you call it meditation, but that's cute. Yes.
But I think from the skeptic or the agnostic that showed up in India and the scientist that showed up in India, it would be not just a little bit disquieting to get in touch with the divine, to have this deep spiritual experience when everything you had known, your whole frame up until that point was one of academic science, logic, reason. This makes sense.
Yes.
You know what I mean? In the world, it may make sense spiritually, but to have that shift must have been very unsettling, at least for a moment.
So,
and I'm wondering if you could speak to those two things, and then I want to talk about your work.
Okay. So first of all, with regard to the trauma, it is the first time I've spoken publicly about it. And the reason for that is, as the book begins, I mean, the preface of the book is me following the instructions of my guru, of Puja Swamiji, to offer the pain and offer the trauma to the sacred Ganga River so that I could be free. And it's an extraordinary story. It was certainly something that I thought, well, obviously this isn't going to work. You know, it was on the third or fourth or fifth day I'd been there. And rivers didn't sweep away people's pain. That wasn't how it happened. There were processes that one had to go through. And so while I never thought it was going to work, I agreed to myself to at least go through the motions he had told me to with sincerity. That given it had been instructed to me by, first of all, the most extraordinary being I had ever encountered in my entire life, an embodiment of love, of divinity, of truth that transcended any religious tradition or dogma. It didn't matter that he happened to be in orange robes in a Hindu tradition. He was not exuding Hinduism. He was exuding infinite divinity and love and compassion. So given that it had been instructed to me by this extraordinary being, and given that I wasn't yet sure still why I actually had come to India, but had taken this vow to keep my heart open, I committed to trying it sincerely. And as you know, because you know me and because you've read the book, it worked. And so from that point mainly, and then from a few other points that I also speak about in the book, where he actually helps me not just let go of the pain and not just forgive, but actually let go of the identity that is wrapped up around being the one who was abused. Because that's a whole other piece. And once that happened, it really no longer was the way that I self-identified. And since it's not the way that I self-identify, and since for me, public speaking and satsang is always about the moment. I mean, I never walk in with a prepared sense of what I'm going to say. In the moment, in the present, that not arises because it isn't how I am identifying in the present. And so it wasn't until I wrote the book and have now been talking in the context of the book that I realized how important it was to share that, even though it's no longer the identity that I'm moving through the world with. Because exactly for the reason, Darren, that you said. Because otherwise people say, oh yeah, that, Sadhvi woman over there, easy for her to say. She doesn't know pain. She doesn't know suffering. She descended as this sort of, virginal angel from the cloud of Stanford onto the land of India, untouched by struggles or strife. And so, of course, this divine presence, this joy, this bliss, this peace is available for her because she only knows the light. And the dilemma with that, aside from being, of course, completely untrue, is that it deprives people of finding their own joy, their own peace, their own freedom, because people feel like, well, I'm disqualified from that because of what I've experienced. And I realized that as long as people thought that I had not experienced pain and difficulty and addiction and trauma and all of the stuff we all go through, that they weren't going to necessarily believe me when I say, you can be free. Whatever has happened to you, you can be free. And I speak as an authority. I know pain, I know suffering, I know trauma, I know addiction, I know depression, I know anxiety, I know pharmaceuticals, I know the whole thing, and I know freedom. I'm not cut from a different cloth. Because in the East, in the world of religion, but especially in the East, you do hear, as you say, mostly only about the light. And in some cases, that's because that is the truth. I mean, I look at my guru. Well, he kind of came out of the womb like this, you know? I mean, at the age of 8, he was already in the jungle, standing on one leg in Vrikshasana for 11 hours a day, in the midst of divine ecstasy. He never thought about, let alone engage in, any concept of lust, greed, jealousy, competition. I mean, nothing. No struggle, no strife, no addiction, nothing. But it's so rare. It's so rare. And it's beautiful. It's inspiring. It's amazing. I mean, you read the stories of Sri Ramakrishna, and they bring us to tears with how exquisite they are. And yet, it's not the sort of stuff that makes us feel like I can do it. I mean, I don't read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and think, oh, well, if he can do it, I can do it.
That's just like my childhood. No, I'm kidding. It's not.
Yes.
So I want to talk a little bit about your work, because I think you have done something really extraordinary. And I also want sort of like a Sadhvi on the street report on how things are going in India, since I haven't been there in so long. Your work, and I am way editing this down to like I could talk for the whole episode just on listing the things you've done. But one of the things that you have done, just broad strokes, is that you've sort of met people where they're at in terms of doing a lot of work around the environment in India, around HIV and AIDS. We had a conversation about that once, about women in India, and there's so many different sort of social issues, or social, I don't like social justice, more just like going out and seeing suffering and then doing something about it. But you've done it in a really interesting way of helping people to see, if you see the Ganga as this sacred river, as the mother goddess, maybe not put junk in it, you know, and helping people reframe that narrative without insulting their faith or their spiritual tradition. And so I'm curious, like, how all of that is going, and maybe anything that I missed that you want to highlight. But I'm also curious how COVID is going in India, because I know there was a huge, devastating wave that went through a few months ago. And I'm wondering how is India doing right now? How are they handling that trauma? How open are they to vaccination? Some of the religious communities here resist the vaccine, thinking it is not good with God. I'm wondering, just run with that.
Sure.
I know I threw a lot out
That's
there.
okay.
But...
We'll start with the COVID situation, and then we'll move back into the work. So the COVID situation, by God's grace, is much better. We actually, if you watch the first full year of COVID, from end of March 2020 to end of March 2021, India did fantastically. Now, you have to look at it in terms of the incidence rates and prevalence rates rather than total numbers, because when you have a country that's more than 1.3 billion people, you're obviously going to have more number of people with COVID than a country that has, 1.5 million people or 2 million people or whatever. So when they would put together these lists of the number of COVID cases, and India always came up at the top, it was painting actually a really incorrect picture, because the only numbers that matter are per 100,000 people, how many are positive, or per 100,000 people, how many new cases a day or new cases a week, or per 100,000 people, how many deaths, rather than total number. So when you look at those, the per 100,000 people, number of cases, number of deaths, for the first year, India did fantastically. It was always at the very bottom, actually, of the list of countries when you looked at it like that rather than total number. In April of 2021 through April and into much of May of 2021, India had a horrendous surge. I think people just weren't taking it seriously. I mean, they never had really taken it seriously. But realize, when you live in a country where you can be killed by a mosquito, you can be killed by the water you drink, you can be killed by any one of innumerable two-wheeled and four-wheeled vehicles being driven by people who are, not confident to be behind the wheel. The chance of death by mosquito, by bad water, by natural disaster, by auto rickshaw driver in India is so high that what I saw was people, it wasn't that they didn't take the illness seriously, it was that there were so many other things that even in the midst of COVID, they were still so much more likely to die from, like malaria, like dengue fever, like typhoid, like so many other things. So they didn't take it very seriously, which was okay as long as the government was imposing very, very strict lockdowns, because nobody wanted to be fined. And in India, the fines and as well as the punishments for violating lockdown, for violating the rules, were huge. If you were known to be COVID positive and you were not quarantined at home and roaming in the streets, people were being booked and arrested under attempt to murder sections of the penal code. This was not like a fine or a suggestion to go home. This was literally a criminal case of intent to murder. So people stayed home. And then as the regulations got less and less, because of course the economy started plummeting, and when you look at numbers, I mean, the government was really in this catch-22 situation, because the number of people suffering due to loss of income and the likelihood of people losing their homes, not having enough money to feed their families due to loss of income was so huge that the government, of course, as the COVID numbers were so low, had to start loosening the COVID restrictions, and they did. And people started gathering in huge numbers. I mean, I remember being at events in March 2021, where I would walk up onto stage to speak, and everybody would be like, "Take off your mask, take off your mask." There'd be signs everywhere saying, "Wear your mask and maintain social distancing." Nobody wore a mask. Nobody maintained social distancing. And people would even say, "Take off your mask." So it didn't surprise me when a month later, the surge started in a huge way. But amazingly, within a couple of months, they really got a handle on it. And by middle or end of May, it started to go down. And now the numbers are just keep going lower, 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 lower. There's talk of the possibility of a third wave, but there's no indication that it's starting. I mean, I check the numbers every few days and they're still going down. Kerala is doing horribly. Kerala is in really bad shape. Otherwise, the rest of the country is doing fantastically. So that's the grace of God. Yes.
I was just going to say, having been to India many times, I thought of this when we were in lockdown and social distancing, and there's like markers to stand in line for your groceries about 6 feet. And I thought, there is no way this is happening in India. It's just physically impossible. I mean, their idea of social distancing is not a piggyback ride. It's...
You know what I had to do in our ashram, because we were very, very strict. And the ashram was closed from March of 2020 to December of 2020. No guests. So, but of course we've got a few hundred permanent residents anyway. And so when we first, started having to implement COVID protocols, I actually had to take one of the guys who lives there and works there and make him lie on the ground. And I put one person at his feet and one person at his head. And I was like, "Does everybody see this?" They all said yes, because the guy on the ground was just 6 feet. And I'm like, these two people now are proper socially distanced. This is what 6 feet looks like. And everyone was like, "Oh my God." I mean, they really thought 6 feet meant, as you say, I'm not on your back. I'm not in your lap. I'm not whispering in your ear. I'm not hugging you. I mean, anything other than physically touching you, chest to chest, chest to back, shoulder to shoulder, counted as social distancing. So, yeah.
Well, like riding in a rickshaw in India, it's like I've had complete strangers all but sitting on my lap. And that doesn't happen in the United States,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's sort of, you get used to it, and it's not that big a deal, except for when there's this infectious disease.
Exactly.
And it just seems like impossible with the crowds and the way everything is structured.
Yes, absolutely.
To achieve that.
Absolutely. And, that lack of social space, other than when there's the pandemic, is something that is actually really beautiful, because when you think about it as a culture, rather than as a ramification of overpopulation, having a stranger basically put their kid in your lap is that stranger has essentially just adopted you as a member of the family.
Yeah.
When I first got to India and I was wearing saris and wearing them not well, tying them not well, I would have all sorts of random Indian women, like on the street, literally stick their hand in my clothes, in my underwear, to fix the part where the sari is pleated. And I used to fold it up here, and they'd stick their hands into my blouse and fixing it. And the first time it happened, I thought, "Oh my God, I've been violated." And then I realized I haven't been violated. I've been adopted. That woman just adopted me. She literally did to me what she would have done to her daughter walking out of the house. If her daughter tried to walk out of the house with as poorly tied sari as I was roaming the streets in, she would have done to her daughter exactly what she just did to me. And how beautiful that she adopted me on the streets.
Yeah.
So I've spent all of these years thinking about the social issues like that. But with regard to the work that we do, our motto really is just respond to the present moment and what it requires. And this is also a big theme in Hollywood to the Himalayas, because I was raised to learn to take, to have, to obtain, that it was kind of all about me. And the teaching is, don't ask what for me, but ask what through me. That how can I be a vehicle, a vessel, a tool, an instrument of service? I mean, and of course, this is the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi. O Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring love. Where there is darkness, light. Let me be this beautiful instrument of healing, of light, of health, of hope. So that was the teaching that I was given so beautifully, is use your life, use your talent, use your energy, use your skill, use every minute and every moment in service. And so we serve, as you said, in a lot of ways. One of them is the purely logistic, on the ground, as in people are hungry, so feed them. People are homeless, so put a roof over their heads. Children are orphans, so take them in. Children are poor with no money for education, so build them schools. Women don't have access to vocational training or empowerment programs or marketable skills. So provide these for them in a way that's free. And so we run orphanages, and we run free schools, and we run free women's empowerment and women's vocational training programs. And the rivers are being polluted, and the trees are being cut down, and climate change is happening. And so we work for all of that. Plant the trees, keep the trees where they are, work for environmental protection, bring water education into schools, work with technology to help purify the water. So we are all about just saying yes to whatever the universe presents to us. And a lot of it is on the ground. It's what we call the ground level work. That's literally construction of schools, construction of women's centers, cleaning of rivers, planting of trees, opening of free medical care clinics and hospitals, and excuse me, running free medical programs in the villages with ambulances. And then there's what we call the grand level. So that's the ground level. And then there's the grand level, which is the convening, the high level convening of bringing leaders of all the different religions together, political leaders together on topics ranging from stigmas around AIDS and HIV, for example, as you said, to issues around women's rights, equality, ending the taboo of menstruation. All of these sorts of topics, ending early child marriage, all of these topics that are massive influences on the way that the society runs, the community runs upon the lives of people who are girls, women, sick, people with HIV or AIDS, people who are living in villages. I mean, whatever aspect of the population, whatever cohort of society you're looking at. Yeah. How can we help remove stigmas, remove taboos that really negatively impact people, whether in the case of AIDS and HIV, for example, taboos that keep them from getting proper medical care or getting the education to prevent it. Or in the case of girls and menstrual hygiene, well, the taboos around menstruation keep schools from teaching menstrual hygiene. So you end up then with girls learning what menstruation is when they start menstruating, which, if you can imagine, literally...
It has to be terrifying if you don't know what it is.
And way over 50%, I think it's like 60, 70% of girls in India learn about menstruation when they start menstruating. And almost 25% of them drop out of school when they start menstruating, simply because they don't have the education to know how to take care of themselves properly, or they don't have access to supplies that enable them to actually go 4 or 5 hours without, bleeding on fabric at home in a separate room away from everybody else in the house. Or their schools don't have toilets, or the toilets at school don't have doors, and so there's no privacy. And so we do a lot of work around those sorts of issues. And by the way, along with that, sorry to interrupt, but just before I forget, 100% of all of the proceeds, all of the money that comes in from the book, every bit of it that comes to me goes straight to the charitable work, straight to the women and the girls and the environmental work and the cleaning of the rivers and provision of water and all of that.
That is amazing. And let me ask you this, because I think social change, whatever the country, we see it here in the United States, everywhere, social change and attitudes and like long-held beliefs that are no longer appropriate and probably were never appropriate, but and we're trying to change. And you're talking about changing attitudes toward women and women's place in society, and there's inevitably pushback to that. Like, there's people who like the status quo; they benefit from the status quo, and I'm wondering what is the response to even talking about things like this? And then taking steps to like make sure girls stay in school. Like, I can imagine that some are thrilled and others are not.
Absolutely. There's always pushback. There's always people who have a very specific agenda and attachment to the status quo for a whole bunch of reasons. And that's okay. We keep working, we keep doing it. There's a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, and yet that's always the case. There was never a guarantee in any of our scriptures or spiritual teachings that says, do God's work and it's going to be really easy. Do God's work and nobody's ever going to try to stop you. Do God's work and everybody's going to support you and be with you. Nobody ever said that in any of the scriptures. God doesn't say, serve me and I'm going to roll out the red carpet. We do the work in the face of the challenge, because that's duty, that's dharma. And slowly, people change. The ripple impact is huge. Darren, I've seen the truth is a magnet. And when you don't try to shove it down people's throats, but you actually just live it and embody it and implement it, eventually it attracts people. Maybe not 100% of them, but it attracts a lot of people, and the ripple impact is it's enormous. And we've seen this. I mean, when we first started talking about using toilets and ending open defecation, people couldn't believe it. Like religious people talking about poop, You don't do that. You don't stand on a stage where you're supposed to talk about God and talk about poop instead. But at that time, and this wasn't that long ago, this was in
when I started going to India.
Well, we started
like
talking about
10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, when I started going to India, there was a noticeable shift in the number of people. It's not that you never see people pooping on the side of the road. You do, but you see much less of it.
Yeah, and absolutely. Well, part of it is that the current government implemented in 2014 a huge Clean India program. So it made things much easier to do the work because suddenly the whole government infrastructure was moving along with the same motto. But when we first started, before they were elected into office, people couldn't believe it. Could not believe that high-level religious leaders were getting up on stages, and instead of telling people how to attain, liberation after death or oneness with God, we're talking about build toilets, use toilets, do not defecate in the open. And the reason that we were doing that was not an aesthetic issue, but it was an issue because at that point, 1,600 children under the age of 5 were dying every single day due to lack of clean water, due to, in large part, the lack of sanitation and hygiene that was pushing all of that defecation, literally, from the fields, from the farms, from the roads, into the groundwater, into the streams, and therefore into the rivers that people were then drinking and bathing in and using for cooking and irrigating their crops and everything like that. So the death rate of children, India had at that time the #1 death by diarrhea rate in the world, largely due to open defecation. There were at that time about 600 million people defecating in the open every day. It was more than 50% of the population at that time. So,
wow.
Yeah. So now, as through the great work that the government did over that period of 2014 to 2019, that number decreased significantly. And so we started shifting. We realized, okay, that was actually really successful. We were able to really change how people think about purity, about cleanliness, about health, about civic responsibility. And now can we use that to change how they think about menstruation, how they think about early child marriage, how they think about so many issues that impact people in society today. So we've been using that power of advocacy in a huge way, and it's been really, really very successful. Oh, and vaccinations, you asked about vaccinations as well. Yeah. So Indians in general have been really pro-vaccine. A lot of the spiritual leaders have gotten vaccinated. Puja Swamiji was one of the first to not only get vaccinated, but to publicly come forward and to do a lot of public advocacy for it, both on TV, in the news, as well as, social media and all of that. And I think for me, the vaccination issue is really an opportunity to make a decision for a community. There's a lot of great arguments on both sides of the debate if we each lived in a vacuum. If the question were only my health, my choice, even I, just as one person, could argue very well both sides of the debate, why it's in your best interest health-wise to get it, why it's in your best interest health-wise not to get it. And I know for me, on a personal level, I vacillated a lot. I'm very hyper careful about what goes in my body. And yet what I realized is this isn't about me. This is about the community we live in. And if I lived in a cave, or even if I lived alone somewhere where I could get all my groceries delivered and have everything delivered to my home, and I never was going to stand out in line at a grocery store with a checkout clerk who might be immunocompromised, or I was never going to stand in front of or behind someone in a checkout line who might be immunocompromised, or I was never going to interact with my parents or anyone who might be immunocompromised, I probably wouldn't get it. Or, and if I didn't want to travel on an airplane. But as long as I'm going to live in a community of people, many of whom may be older, may be immunocompromised, it felt like such a beautiful opportunity to make a choice to do something that wasn't what I would ordinarily do, but that was solely in the interest of me protecting those around me. Because I was pretty sure from the beginning that if I got it, I would be either asymptomatic or certainly nothing that was going to kill me. And yet the idea that I could walk around carrying it and give it to someone who was likely to be very sick or die was, I thought, God, you know what? That's not karma that I want. We've got a lot of elderly widows. There's a lot of elderly saints in the ashram. Everybody's got diabetes and blood pressure and whatnot. It's like, I don't want that karma.
One of the things we need to talk about how people can get your book and stuff. But before that, I just want to, one of the things I've thought about talking to you over the years is how much you remind me of Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. You're so good at understanding that this is sort of a pyramid. It's not meditate and then, hope for the best with the food or the place to sleep or the medicine. But that having those needs met enable you to do those deeper practices, to do that self-inquiry. That's really hard to do when you're worried about where your next meal is coming from or how your kid is going to get some medicine. And I just really appreciate that about you, because sometimes we don't hear that. It's sort of like the spiritual world and the physical world seem to be at odds, and you've always managed to merge those two beautifully and take action in the physical world in very incredibly meaningful ways. And I just really appreciate you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Darren. Thank you. I appreciate you so much, so deeply.
I literally could talk to you for another week, but I know you're busy. So a few things. September 21st, 2021. You could be listening to this in 2025, in which case let me know how it all turned out. But if you're listening to this somewhere near when I publish it, please join Sadhvi at Grace Cathedral immediately following my yoga class on the 21st. It's a Tuesday night, and you can get tickets through the Grace Cathedral website, gracecathedral.org. Her new book is Hollywood to the Himalayas. Did I get it right? Did I say it Indian style?
But Himalayas is also okay. Either way.
Isn't Himalayas how the British did it, and Himalayas how,
Himalayas
more
is
Indian?
The way the Indians do it. I don't know how the Britishers do it. I know that in America, people say Himalayas.
Yeah. Well, as an American, of course, we're the center of the universe, right? That's what I've been told. So I'm wondering if there are other things you want to announce, obviously time-sensitive stuff, make sure you note that. And also, how can people get in touch with you? And if they're moved by some of the work you're doing, how can they get involved in supporting women in India, environmental cleanup, any aspect of the stuff you've already talked about?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Darren. Yeah. So my new book, Hollywood to the Himalayas, or Hollywood to the Himalayas, is available now. I would love you to get it. I would love to hear how it impacts you. The subtitle is A Journey of Healing and Transformation. And it shares my story from Hollywood to the Himalayas, both the physical story, the great spiritual adventure of it all, but also the shift in thought patterns, shift in mindset that enabled me to heal from my past, to let go, to forgive, to awaken, to be free, to find the joy and the peace that is our birthright, that is who we are. And that is something that is available for all of you. And that's why I wrote the book, as we spoke about in the beginning. So I would love you to get the book. I would love you to read it. And then I would love you to let me know how you find healing, transformation, freedom in your life through these lessons that I learned and that I share in the book. And the easiest way to do that, obviously, you can just immediately go to Amazon.com or the bookseller of your choice and type in Hollywood to the Himalayas and buy it. You can also go to hollywoodtothehimalayas.com if you want to learn more about the book before you buy it, or you just want to read more about it before it arrives on your doorstep after you buy it. Either way, hollywoodtothehimalayas.com. And it's all about the book. It's got all of the details of past and upcoming tour dates, all of the fun testimonials from everyone ranging from Jane Goodall to Prince EA to Marianne Williamson and Deepak Chopra and kind of everyone in between. That's all on Amazon actually as well. So you could get that in both places. But hollywoodtothehimalayas.com also will direct you to our other links. So it'll take you to my personal website, which is sadhvig.org. It'll take you to our foundation websites, to divineshaktifoundation.org, which is the foundation for women and children and education that we run. It'll take you to our global interfaith WASH Alliance, the water sanitation hygiene work that we do. So hollywoodtothehimalayas.com is kind of the easiest place to go to. It's also the easiest link to remember. If you go there, you can get linked to all of our other websites. And when you buy it, when you read it, please, I would love to hear from you. So on Amazon or on the website or on social media, share with me, or by email, share with me how you've been impacted by it. Because yes, 100% of the money goes to the women and the girls and the humanitarian work. But everything I do goes to that. And the hundreds of hours that went into the preparation of the book are so that you can all have that same extraordinary healing and transformation. So I really, really love hearing from people how it impacted them, because it makes me know, yes, all those hundreds of hours, yes, it's having the ripple impact that the world needs.
Well, you have been working on this book for as long as I've known you.
Yes.
You've been talking about it and pulling it together and editing it, and we've had conversations about it on numerous times. And when I got the presser from your publicist, I was like, yes! I felt like the longest pregnancy ever.
Yes, yes. We actually gave birth to a baby elephant instead. Yes.
I am just so incredibly proud of you and so honored that you're my friend, and the work you do is truly, truly amazing. And I will, of course, put links to everything in the show notes for whether you're watching the video or the audio podcast. So check there and you can get a quick click-through link to all the stuff Sadhvi mentioned.
Thank you. And I also
Sadhvi,
really
thank you
I look forward to seeing everybody at Grace Cathedral next week. For those of you who are hopefully listening to this right at the beginning when Darren launches it, September 21st, really look forward to meeting you all there. There'll be lots of time for questions and answers, interactions. So it'll be beautiful to meet you all. And thank you so much, Darren. It's been so beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. And one thing I just wanted to say about that event, I know a lot of people are concerned about COVID. We have worked really hard in my yoga class at the cathedral and just other stuff like Sadhvi coming to socially distance. Masks and vaccines are required. So, and it's big and spacious, and they keep the doors open. It's the closest thing you can get to outdoors and have a roof over your head. So please come, and I'm so excited to see you in person.
Beautiful.
Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.